I'll begin doing that. Okay. All right, good morning, everybody. We will, as soon as I can find it, begin today's class. There we go. All right. And slideshow from beginning. All right, off we go. Today is class 2. We're going to be specifically looking at Israeli politics as they relate to the economy. We'll be starting with, actually, before we get into it, we'll do a little bit of a review from last class. Then we'll get into a case study, specifically looking at the budget today. And then we're going to look at the politics and economics from the past, looking back in the pre-state era, and will take us to today, and we'll see how economics and politics all intertwine together in Israel. So without further ado, let's get started. Again, just to contextualize where we are in our 5-class series, we last class looked at we looked at the Israeli political structure more generally. Today, we're going to be looking at the economy. Next week, parties, and etc. So that is what is to come. So we're looking forward to talking about the economy and politics today. All right. So as promised, when you guys ask us questions that we are unable to answer, and you had quite a few of them last time. All right, buddy, you need to go somewhere else. Thank you. When you ask us great questions that we're unable to answer, and there was quite a few, we loved the questions. We promised to research, and so we did. A lot of them were around ballots, how the elections happen, ballots, ballot security, etc. And so we looked into that. And we have a few answers. I hope we got to most of them. If there are still outstanding questions, we invite you to ask them, and we'll continue researching. So question 1 on ballot security. Number 1, there's an article you can see that you can link to. It's the bottom right hand of the screen from the Times of Israel. Has a pretty robust look at ballot security, how elections are secured, etc. And one of them is that they're entirely paper, as we talked about last time. They're little slips of paper, and they go into, you can now see on the top left, into a secure envelope. It's not just that you take your little piece of paper with the party designation on it and drop it into a box. You have to put it into an envelope. Everybody only gets one envelope that's signed by multiple officials and you, and it's only at one location where you have to pre-register. You get your single envelope. That is really the thing that is necessary to vote. You take your slip of paper, you stick it into the envelope, and that, of course, allows for privacy too. And then you bring it over to the box, which is now corrugated. It used, in my research, I discovered it used to actually be these heavily fortified wood boxes that we don't do anymore. Now it's just a corrugated piece of a box. Stick it in, and that's how you vote, and all sorts of other security measures. Other questions that you guys asked were about languages. I was unable to locate a specific number as to how many ballots are contain languages other than Hebrew, but just by an unofficial survey, just of Google images and articles I was able to find, it seems as if the vast majority of ballots are printed only in Hebrew, as you can see in the middle image here, and a handful, as you can see on the one on the left, on the right, are printed both in Hebrew and in Arabic. I was unable to find ballots in Russian, which would be another language that you might expect to see them in. Doesn't mean they don't exist. I just couldn't find them. But in any event, most are in Hebrew, and then some are, I imagine, in locations, for example, like Haifa or Lod, Ramla, that would have them in Arabic too. All right, so the last piece is a bonus piece. Nobody asked about this, but I discovered it in my research. A fascinating story about where the ballots are actually printed, and it turns out that they're printed in the West Bank, in the in Palestinian employed factories. So it's Palestinians to a large extent who are producing and printing the ballots. And the article gets into the really complicated nature of this story, which is essentially that the people who are creating the ballots don't actually have political access to them. They can't vote in Israeli elections, which obviously for many people is problematic. But at the same time, on the other side of it, other people would argue this is providing, especially with the great number of times that Israelis seem to vote, how often Israelis seem to vote, quite a bit of jobs for Palestinians. So it's a complicated story. So for those of you who are interested, there's a link to that story. Read it, and of course those sorts of topics are ones that John and I are happy to discuss in detail if that's something that people are interested in. So that is a few of the issues that people asked about from last class. As promised, we did some research and have some answers, and we are now ready to begin today's class. All right, so we're going to be talking about the economy. And before we do the economy and politics, before we do, I want to start with a Pew survey that came out from 2017. So obviously it's a little bit old, approximately 4 years old, but in many ways the landscape of Israeli politics is similar to what it was, and John and I surmise that it probably doesn't look terribly different, these stats today, than they would have a couple of years ago. So with that, just wondering, what do you notice? What do you see in these statistics? Anything that jumps out at you, or any questions that these raise? Rick.
Yes, is this about U.S. Jews facing these issues in the United States, or worried about facing these issues in Israel?
These are perceptions of you. It's a great question of American Jews. What do you think the greatest concern is in Israel?
In Israel, okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm surprised by something. I'm surprised the social, religious, and political problems aren't more of a problem, because they would be for me if I were living in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And in fact, actually, as we alluded to last week, and actually we're going to talk about today as well, because it actually has some important implications in the budget. They are important to quite a few people. And we saw, for example, we saw Avigdor Lieberman making that a central part of his platform, and so it is
14%. 14% is not a lot of people.
It's still less than you would imagine. Yep. And that is why we have made the economy such an important part of our class series.
You know, part of what I think is that if this was rank them in rank order, then it's not surprising.
Mm-hmm.
You know, yep. So if I would be worried about paying my bills even more than the social problems. So, you know, it depends on how the question was asked, and it says the most important. So that may be why the numbers appear so low.
Look, it's resonant. Yeah, it's resonant of when Bill Clinton ran for the first time in 1992 and was getting caught up in discussions about foreign policy and other things, and was losing traction, and realized, wait a second, that's not what Americans want to talk about. And he put on his mirror, "It's the economy, stupid," just to remind himself constantly every morning when he got himself ready to go campaign, talk about the economy. That's the thing. Sandy, yes.
I think I'll explain from my own experience how the news, how the show are received or acquired in United States. And here is my experience. I hear on, even on Time of Israel, but all the other news channels, CNN, etc. And I reach for the phone, and immediately, day or night, call my family, friends, or whatever. And they're stunned. They say, "What are you talking about?" And I say, "Oh, there was a bombing. Oh, was something there, an attack." And he said, and the reply was, either they are sort of dull by now with the security situation there, or I'm simply exaggerating. However, what I think from the economic problem, we hear only about these startups and all these success stories, but very few, at least in the United States, get I would say the dirty family laundry about paying the bills and the fact that they cannot afford to travel anymore, or things like that, unemployment, etc. So to conclude my comment, I think it has to do with how do we in the United States get the information, what channels, and how deep are we digging when something shows up on the news.
Yeah, I think that is incredibly insightful, and I think that is a big part of it. And in fact, actually, in many ways, presages what we're going to be getting to towards the end of our class today. So we'll look into that, and we'll see what those economic concerns look like today. And I guess I'll just tease it by saying cottage cheese, but we'll come back to that and explore that a bit later in the class. So Sandy, I think that's a very, very helpful reminder for us as we start today's class. Very quickly reviewing what we did last class, both to just refresh our memory and also to bring us forward, because what we looked at last class is going to play a huge role in today's class as well. So we looked at coalition building, how complicated it has been over the past couple of years to do so, why it's been so complicated, and we landed towards the end of the class on the 24th Knesset, as you can see here on the top left-hand corner, with Likud having an overwhelming share of the votes, but only a plurality of the votes, not a majority of the votes. And so they actually cannot form a government and are in the minority. They are the opposition right now, and currently it is Yamina who has the premiership, and they're only with 7 votes, and Yesh Atid had to take a back seat for the first part, even though they had 17 votes, but they will have the premiership soon. So we ended up having a much more anti-Bibi centered coalition than based on anything else. It is certainly a right-leaning government, as you can see from our next slide, but oops, it's not moving. There we go. It is certainly a right-leaning government, but it is largely based on being an anti-Bibi coalition, and that's going to be really, really important as we move forward as well. And you remember, and we will talk about this momentarily, it was largely the decision of Yamina and the Arab Party led by Ram and Mansour Abbas, who had basically said, we'll go to either side depending on where it seems to work out best for us, and ultimately did decide to go over their 11 votes, moved over to the anti-Bibi side and pushed it over to a 61 vote majority for the anti-Bibi coalition. All right. So that was review. And John, I can't remember if you take over here, if I'll be doing this now. This is
Yes, I'll take care of it. I'll ask you to share the video in a moment, the
Yes.
commercials. So thank you, Yoni, for setting that up. The one test of any government, any coalition throughout Israeli history is, can they pass a budget? It's something required by Knesset law. We'll be going to the detail of that in a moment. What we'd like to do first is we're going to show you 3 commercials from the past campaign, and we'd like you to listen for the values of these parties and their economic goals. So listen carefully for each, and we'll review each of them as we go through, and then we'll apply them to how did the budget that was just passed recently, how did those values play out in the budget? So we're going to look at these 3 videos together. First, we're going to watch one more time the same video we showed you last week by Naftali Bennett, head of Yamina, the current prime minister, and his economic vision, followed by the Meretz party, representing the left, and followed by the Shas party, one of the Haredi parties of Sephardic and Mizrahi background. And again, listen for in each commercial, what are the values and what are the economic goals?
So John, I think because of the technical issues, we don't have to get into what they are now, but I think we'll play them consecutively. I think that probably makes most sense. Is that,
Fine.
yeah,
Not a problem.
so let's do that, and then what I think I would suggest for people is, if you have a pen and paper, just to jot down the values. What are the underlying, as you're watching the ads, what seem to be the underlying values of the 3 different parties and the economy. So. All right, so John, we ready to go?
Yes, we are. Please.
All right, so here we go.
אני מציג בפניכם היום את התוכנית הכלכלית הנועזת ביותר שנעשתה כאן. תוכנית שתהפוך את ישראל לגן עדן לאזרחים. כל ישראלי שעובד יהיה פי 2 יותר עשיר. התוכנית תאפשר לעשרות אלפי עסקים חדשים לשגשג. גם לפני הקורונה קשה היה כאן לשרוד כלכלית. עכשיו הזמן לתת מכת חשמל שתכניס אנרגיות אדירות לכלכלה, תעורר את המערכת העייפה ותזניק את ישראל לרמה של המדינות הכי עשירות בעולם. אני מציג היום את תוכנית סינגפור, תוכנית שמפחיתה דרמטית מיסים, מגדילה מאוד את משכורת הנטו של משפחות עובדות ומרסקת את הבירוקרטיה ההרסנית. רק עם פעולה נועזת נצליח להיחלץ מהמשבר ולעבור במהירות לצמיחה אדירה. רייגן עשה את זה בארצות הברית, תאצ'ר עשתה את זה באנגליה, ואנחנו נעשה את זה כאן בישראל. לכל אותם אנשים שתמיד מנסים לייאש אותנו, שמעתי אותם בקבינט כשדחפתי לחסל את מנהרות הטרור, וגם במשבר הקורונה הם אמרו שאי אפשר לייצר 100,000 בדיקות ביום בישראל. הם תמיד יצעקו אי אפשר, אבל אנחנו נוכיח להם שאפשר. הכוח בידיים שלנו.
All right,
Okay.
so, sorry. All right, let me.
Find the correlation in the future.
All right, I think I need to. So while I'm readjusting this, you can all take a few notes on what you saw. What are the values? And all right. So John, we're going to do merits next.
Please.
All right. Okay. All right. Can you see the screen?
You're still showing the PowerPoint.
Still showing the PowerPoint. New share. And oh, here we go. This should be it. Okay. Now we have the merits.
Yes.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right, off we go.
רק מרץ נלחמת למען המובטלים החדשים. רק מרץ נלחמת במושחתים מכל הצדדים. רק מרץ נלחמת למען צדק חברתי ושוויון. בלי שקרים, בלי עריקים. רק מרץ, הבית של השמאל.
That one went by fast, so we can.
מבצע החיסונים הישראלי מהדהד בכל העולם.
העולם רואה אותם חוזרים בחיים, מחזירים את הכלכלה לשיאה. ועכשיו, הדרכון הירוק שמאפשר לכל ישראל שמתחסן חזרה במילה השגרה.
Okay, so again, think about the contrast between that video and some of the words used economically compared to the first. And in a moment, we'll be adding a third, which will be a Shas, which again is a Sephardi Mizrahi Haredi ultra-Orthodox party and their approach to economics.
All right. And here is. All right. Are we? Can you see the screen?
Yes, yes, we can. Yeah.
All right. Here we go. Shas.
קוסקוס בשלישי זה מסורת. מכבי בחמישי זה מסורת. קידוש בשישי זה מסורת.
לעשות כל יכולתנו לחזק את אחינו העניים, לגדל אותם, לרומם אותם.
אצלנו גם דאגה לחלשים, זאת מסורת.
Fast. Caught the, you can see the economic piece at the very end there. All right.
Great. So in a minute, we're going to go into the budget and we'll look at the current budget where each of these, well, I'd say the first two parties played a role. Shas in the past has played a role, but being in the opposition, they did not have the ability to shape the budget. Well, yeah, so thank you, Yoni. So now we have on the screen again, Meretz, and we have Yamina with Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, and Shas in that order. So the top screen, the green representing Meretz, really Israel's Green Party, Naftali Bennett in the middle, Shas at the bottom. We'd love to hear a few thoughts and words. What were some of the words, ideas that you heard for you can pick any party you'd like. What did you notice that they were standing for when it came to the economy? As this will help us to analyze the budget. What's something that you noticed that one of the parties articulated?
So,
Hey, Bob, thank you, please.
okay. So, Meretz addressed social justice. Yeah. Yamina was more of a global deregulation approach.
Good.
I would say. I mean,
Excellent.
and Shas talked about the unemployed, but that's kind of puzzling because don't many of their supporters choose to be unemployed?
Ah, very interesting question. Good. So first, good framing of each. And let's talk about Shas for a moment. So yeah, Shas are Orthodox Haredi, where some in their community, sure, would like to have the ability to study in yeshivot, not serve in the army, have those opportunities. That's true. But Shas has always had a broader reach throughout its history, beyond the ultra-Orthodox and the religious, to say, because the Sephardim and the Mizrahim were immigrant groups that came in bigger numbers later after the state was established and often felt that they were the disenfranchised, disempowered, going back to the beginning of the state through the 70s and until the Likud party took power. They felt like they were not getting the economic services that they needed, that they faced job discrimination and the like. So Shas is always very cleverly, even though they are largely an ultra-Orthodox party, thinking about that entire ethnic community to say, we're here to fight for you too, and for your social welfare benefits. So thank you for raising that question. Yeah, so Roberta and David, next, please.
Well, I was going to say the opposite. It didn't sound to me like they were advocating for any sort of universal values. It felt to me like it was a very thinly disguised play for basically saying we want the budget to spend money on religious things, cementing, the things that are important to us religiously. No bus service on Saturday, blah, blah, blah. And we want more money for those people who are not employed. That is the Haredim.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And there's no doubt, if you were to look at past budgets, where would the majority of their effort, energy, and money go, are to those things. I will say, though, that and it's been shown through Israeli exit polls that in the past, other Sephardic and Mizrahi, so those who come from the Middle East Jews, would vote for them on the basis of economic issues. I think that appeal, as time has gone on, has diminished because other parties have filled the void to say we are truly going to fight for economic rights. So you're right, yes. So for sure, when you look at who actually voted for them in this last cycle, definitely by far the community that you described. So that's absolutely right.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, and I think that this has been an internal discussion within Israeli politics for a long time. You see, similar conversations in America, people screaming at non-religious Sephardi voters who have voted overwhelmingly for Shas for so long. Why are you doing this? Don't you see it's not in your best interest to be voting for Shas? There's so many things that they stand for that are diametrically opposed to what you want in this world, trying to force religion down your throat, that sort of thing. And so the question of why the Sephardi community has so overwhelmingly supported them, on top of that, when their leader today, Aryeh Deri, has been indicted and jailed for corruption, and he's still their leader today, is mind-boggling to people, but I think gets at what we were saying earlier also about how important economics can be in your decision-making. So, but David, that was a really important point. Yeah. Anyway, John, sorry. Yeah.
So good. So I think we're going to proceed, but and thank you for those initial summary comments. You're going to apply them to what we're going to do next, which is to look at the 2021 budget.
Do we want to just say a quick word about Ram in there, that we were going to connect the Ram vision with the Shas vision? Was that, John, did you want to?
Oh, I can add that, yes. And we'll be talking about this later too, which is that, so Ram, we mentioned Naftali Bennett was a kingmaker, and Ram, this Islamic Movement Party, was another one. What's interesting here is why did they choose to cooperate in government when past Israeli Arab parties have not? Well, we know explicitly that Mansour Abbas has said, and reports about this, is that he looked at how the Haredi parties have operated, both Shas and UTJ from the Ashkenazic side, to say, maybe it's time for the Israeli Arab community to play the same game of politics. We'll be in the government, and we will be with left or right coalitions, as Haredi parties have been in the past, provided that the budget delivers for us and for our community. And when we walk through parts of the budget that you'll see in a moment, and we'll tell a few stories at the very end of our presentation, That seems to be what has been achieved by Ram in this early budget, exactly what he wanted. More for schools and for particular Arab and namely Bedouin communities in the Negev was something he advocated for, and they were delivered those promises. So it's an interesting shift in strategy that even though Shas, as I mentioned a moment ago, is not in the government, their strategy that Ram is adopting it for their own purpose, and they are in the government. And again, we'll look at the budget in a moment to see how successful they've been.
And to just further the parallel as well, Ram is actually also a very traditional, they're an Islamist, they're a proudly Islamist party as well. And one of the, for example, one of the positions that Mansour Abbas has taken, made him very popular with some and very unpopular with others, are very anti-LGBTQ positions with, on social policy as well. So there are quite a few parallels between Shas and Ram, both socially and economically. All right, without further ado.
Can I just make a comment? One of the things that interests me is that there was sort of no mention of those who are not religiously active, or so the only option, of course, is the left-wing party, but not all those people may be otherwise liberal, but there's really no space in the conversation for those people who don't make religion central in their life.
So you're referring to the Chiloni, the secular Israeli. So, and one thing to say is we only showed 3 of 15 different parties, if not more, who ran. Okay. But you still make a fair point. And I would say, if you look at those voters, how did they poll? What was concern for them, especially in Greater Tel Aviv? We could go back to the map we linked to last time. It was very much the question is, who's going to be the leader? Is it going to be Prime Minister Netanyahu or not? And the secular tended to trend away from Prime Minister Netanyahu. He made a clear choice, which was somewhat different than early Likud leaders, to align himself more and more with religious voices in Israeli politics. So many of the seculars said, well, the most important thing is to get Prime Minister Netanyahu out of office if we want to have change when it comes to those issues of religion and state. And they were attracted to Kahol Lavan. They were attracted to Yesh Atid. They were attracted to Avigdor Lieberman if they were immigrants from the former Soviet Union who care about these religion and state issues. They really much put their energy there as the best way to make progress. And we're going to talk about some of those religion and state issues in a moment. You will see they were explicitly mentioned in the budget, at least in a few areas.
And I would certainly invite you and everyone to be thinking, do the religious issues in the budget move us more towards a secular Israeli, society, or does it strengthen it? I think it's a really complicated question. So that's
yes.
We'll get into that. Yeah.
Good. So what we're going to do now is the 2021 budget has 13 parts to it. We're going to do the first 2 together to kind of model these questions of who seems to have won from these first 2 budget provisions, what did they get, and then at the end to summarize, was there anything that doesn't seem to be there that surprises you in terms of the values you saw in those first 3 ads. So let's do this first one together and to kind of model and discuss it, and then in a moment you'll go into breakout groups to look at the other parts of the budget. So let me read these aloud, and as I read them, think back to the ads that you just saw and the values. Does it seem to represent Yamina and Naftali Bennett, the first ad, Meretz, the second ad from the left, Shas, the third, or none of the above? It could be something else. All right, so I'm going to read I'll read the first 2, and then we'll open it up to what you think. So the first key part, lowering the cost of living. Nearly all imports to the country currently require domestic regulatory approval. New laws will significantly eliminate import regulations. This is meant to increase competition for products, electronics, food, cosmetics, toys, etc., in the market and lower prices for consumers. And number 2 is reforming the agricultural sector to allow the import of produce, including eggs and dairy products from abroad. The plan also comes with a generous package of government grants for upgrading farms and infrastructure, including new tax breaks to encourage commercial investment in agriculture. A separate reform will allow the growth of the legal marijuana industry in the country. So as you listen to these first 2 parts of the budget, I'm curious, do they seem to reflect the priorities of Yamina, again, of Naftali Bennett, of Meretz, of Shas, of none of the above? Anything that strikes you in the words, the ideas that you see thus far?
Sounds like Yamina to me.
Yeah, tell us what words or what ideas strike you like Yamina.
The idea of deregulation, to increasing competition, tax breaks, to encourage commercial investment. All those things are sort of Reagan Thatcher Yamina ideas.
Excellent. That's right. And I think that's exactly right. And so you can think about, remember Yamina, he's the prime minister with 7 seats. So what were things that he would hope to have achieved by being prime minister? And could this truly be seen as a victory for the vision you saw in the ad being delivered in this budget, at least on these first 2 items? So that's the kind of exercise we'd like you to think about as you'll go through the rest, the next 4 slides. So in a moment, we'll put you into breakout groups to give you a few minutes to look through the other ideas. And again, do they seem to be Yamina ideas, Meretz ideas, Shas, other groups, Ram, none of the above? Whose ideas seem to be winning, and what does it say about budget priorities and where this new government might be taking the state of Israel?
Okay. John, can you just tell, because I don't have the screen with the folks. How many folks do we have in our session?
Or I can make the breakout rooms if you like. It's no problem.
I have it ready to go. I just want to, do I make 3 breakout rooms for what?
Yeah, probably, let's say 3. I think 3 will work for this.
Okay. All right. So, oh yeah, that looks good. Okay. So should I unleash the hounds?
Yes, you may. So take a few moments and we look forward to your observations and questions soon.
Excellent.
Good. So Arev, I think we got room 3 for you. If you can find that, are you able to find, Arev, the place to join room 3? An invitation to do that?
Interesting. Arev may be on 2 breakout.
But both are in room 3 as it happens.
I declined to enter the breakout room.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I had the option and I took it.
Okay.
So you prefer not to talk with, okay.
Is that something generally you'd prefer not to do? Which is fine. Don't want to, nobody's.
No, I just have nothing to contribute to this one. And I'd like to go get the second part of my breakfast.
Oh, okay.
I can listen. I can listen.
No pressure at all.
I can listen all the way to the kitchen. But I wanted to take the video in the farthest room from the kitchen.
Got it. Okay. Sounds good. Enjoy the second half of your breakfast. Hi guys. Did you guys come back to the main room on purpose?
Well, Arev didn't join them. That was their only other partner. So it's okay. You can chat with us. Yeah, we were just starting with Arev.
We were alone.
Where is she?
Oh, there's
I see. Okay, got it.
I see.
So yeah, she has to take care of other matters. So we're happy to chat with you while we wait for the others.
Happy to do that. So.
Oh, there's she.
Oh, hi, Rev. Okay, so what's the, excuse me, what's the plan?
Go through the budget and say who's responsible for what?
Yeah, who's responsible, who's winning, whose values do you see in each of these items? Does it continue to be Bennett? Are there other values at play in what this budget promises? So
Yamina
Got it.
So in Yamina is Naftali Bennett, the deregulation that you said, right? And then coming from the left, like Meretz or others. So take the third one, easing regulation for small and medium businesses for processes such as licensing, requests for government funding, tax payments, and access to foreign investment.
That sounds like Yamina, but it also sounds more middle of the road because we're thinking about small and medium businesses rather than big corporations. So a little of both.
That's right. I think that's right. And very reflective of COVID and the same struggles we've had in America around small and medium businesses, and Naftali Bennett's focus on that. Good. Raising the retirement age from women to 65 to increase the employment rate of older women, decrease the gender salary gap, and stabilize the funds of the National Insurance Institute. Kind of their form of Social Security, their social benefits.
Is this a equality kind of thing? I mean, what's the retirement age for men?
It's a good question. I believe it's 65.
I think it's 65. I'm pretty sure when I was looking, I think I saw 65, but I can look into that. Yeah.
Yes.
So part of this simply treats women the same as men at the moment, right?
Right. That's right.
But I was thinking that it's also sort of a Shas thing because they want their women working.
Mm-hmm. That's
But I
interesting.
think Meretz-
And notice that Shas is out of government, right? So that's actually a very good observation, David. This is a chance when they're not in government to pass reforms like this. They could have no true voice on it if the majority holds.
Right. I also thought that, I'm just going back now to the first two. I also thought that part of the intention of these budget provisions is to raise or increase the constituency for certain parties.
Yes.
So if Yamina is pushing these things, they're really trying to appeal to as many members of the society as possible.
Definitely.
Starting with consumers, which is everyone.
No, you're absolutely right. They have to show, can they deliver? He only got 7 seats. If he wants to stay in power, he's got to deliver them more than his constituency. You're spot on that. Definitely.
Right. I don't know about number 5, the shadow economy.
Okay, so this is a long history on what's called the shadow economy, basically where you would have, especially back in the days, 1950s and 60s, where the government was heavily regulating, tightly controlling the production of goods, wage, prices, etc. You had the behind the scenes, what we call the black market economy in America, flourishing in Israel. And so the idea basically would be to set up new electronically based financial transaction records to be able to see who is buying what and how are things being paid for, etc. That's the basic idea there, and it's largely tied to taxes. Who's going to pay taxes on these things?
Well, that has to be a merits thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. Is that a merits thing? Yeah.
Sound like Yamina.
That
Well,
Yamina.
It could be either, because Yamina is also interested in stimulating the economy, and the black market isn't really so good for the economy.
Yeah, but this is new regulation.
That's true.
This is not
That's
taking
true.
regulation away, is it?
That is true. It is new regulation. The question is and the number one question with any economic feature of a budget is who does this help?
Right,
Who is the beneficiary here? So it could very well be right. It's adding bureaucracy, but at the same time, it's going to shift spending now towards the more established businesses, et cetera, which may be a more Yamina sort of thing.
Right. And assure that all the legitimate revenue goes to the government. And in a time of tight budgets, or they're tightening things up, and that benefits all the parties to say, if it's on the black market, you don't get the taxes from that. So
I actually think this could appeal to everybody.
that's right.
It's a very clever one, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's make sure we get to the rest of them and invite everybody back in. So you have banking reforms.
Well, that seems like a Yamina kind of thing.
Definitely. Easing regulation. That's the
Yeah,
heart of it.
definitely.
Absolutely. So we have the education budget, and this is a complicated one. I tried to edit this one down, but there's too many details in here that I felt I couldn't leave out. But
Right. So you see English, you see about preparing for the future economy, 21st century technology education.
It sounds like merits to me.
yeah, there's a yep, and you have a lot of special
Special education,
Special
education in
yeah.
there.
Right.
Yep.
reduce educational and social gaps.
Well, to me, the real question is, does it do anything for the religious or not?
Yep.
Yeah.
No.
Well, what's complicated there, and we can talk about this in the big group, is there are 4 separate school systems in Israel. Right? The Haredi have their own, the Arab society has its own, secular, national schools, and religious Zionists. And
Right.
some coordination, but also a lot of differentiation between what curriculum looks like and how it plays out in society. So
The one element that may get at what you're asking about, David, and also may make this a less merits thing is this line here. The ministry also plans to advance a program intended to increase school principals' autonomy for more agile decision making. So
Yeah.
let's localize decision making rather than have it, come from Jerusalem, from the Knesset.
Right.
Yeah,
That makes
exactly.
sense. Yep.
Healthcare, general wellness, preventative medicine, expansion of digital access to primary care.
right. And also a lot about mental health you see here, which is in this country too. Will that be how that will be covered? And
New campaigns to reduce childhood obesity, smoking, and bad nutrition. So no more 20-ounce big sodas or whatever.
This is social welfare, I think, and social justice.
yes. Yes. And we'll say with a big group, Merits is in charge of that portfolio within the government. They're the Ministry of Health. So you can see that they're delivering on their promise there.
Right.
More housing.
I can't read this. It's really small.
Too small, yeah.
Oh, thanks. That's much better.
More housing. More housing. Yeah, so the
Housing.
question is where?
Yep.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Where are they going to build these houses?
Question.
Indeed. Overhauling public transportation. This is a particularly complicated one. Who wins on this one here? On the one hand, it enables private entities to set up their own systems of ride sharing, et cetera.
But then there's public and private sector partnerships,
Mhm.
parking spaces.
Well, so
But a metro project is less unique.
Correct. Yep.
I was just thinking about this private transportation thing. Obviously, that would serve, the religious community, it seems to me. But why, I mean, has that not been in place before, or because public is free, essentially? They didn't feel, and it was geared in part to the religious. They didn't feel the need to have private. I'm just thinking, to me, the analogy is, the Orthodox Ambulance Corps in the Lower East Side in Williamsburg,
Yeah.
right?
Yep, that's a big part of it. Another part of this, which actually that they're trying to set up ride sharing solutions to get more people. Yes, not necessarily into buses, into private cars, but it has a lot to do with congestion in major cities. That Tel Aviv is almost impossible to drive around, et cetera. So that's a part of the story also. Let's make sure we get to
Yeah, Yoni, just let you know, I told the group about 1 minute. We'll bring them back.
that. Yep.
So 3 more.
Clean
Yep.
energy.
There they are. Encouraging transition to clean energy.
Okay, we're talking, let's see, switching to electricity. This sounds like Merits to me.
Yep.
Yep.
Boosting high tech. National program including artificial intelligence to promote development of technologies, removing bureaucracy to encourage.
Yeah, now we're at Yamina. Although, I don't think Merits would have a lot of problem with this either, in terms of attracting talent back to Israel from abroad.
Right. That's integration of Arab workers into the tech.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And that's what I was going to say. Yeah.
And maybe the most complicated one of all, number 13, we saved the best for last. Go ahead, take a read on that one.
Oh, wow. Oh, God.
Well, I can't imagine,
This is
Shas,
Yamina.
for example, would be in favor of this.
They wouldn't, and they're out of government, so they can't do anything about it,
Can't
which
do
is why they're
anything about
kicking and screaming at the moment.
Yeah, I love that. That makes me very happy. Oh, did I just show my stripes? I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
really.
Not allowed to do that in this class. Okay, so I think we are going to be rejoining. Excellent. We'll be rejoining in 5 seconds. So,
5,
Thank you.
4, 3.
sure. All right, of course. Yeah, it was fun.
Okay, we are back into the big room.
Yes, welcome back to everyone. So we're, maybe let's go to the next slide. We have kind of the overview slide of all the items that we've seen. We can go back to any text that you would like. And we don't have to, of course, go through all 13, but we wanted to give you a visual and a way to think about, when you look at this budget overall, whose values seem to be prevailing in part and whole, and as you were going through the 13. We'd love to hear observations from the groups, what you discovered and discussed.
Question, why did you put Shas and Ram together? They may not have always exactly the same things.
No, they don't. No, they really do disagree on a lot. The point there was to say that Ram is copying Shas's model of being in government. Not that they share the same values.
Yeah.
What we were arguing is that each is trying to, how can we get the most money for our community? Is the shared political strategy is what we meant to say. So sorry if that was confusing. So thank you for asking that. Yeah, they're definitely not aligned because Ram's in the government and Shas is out now. But Ram said, how was Shas successful in the past? We're going to try the same thing now that we're part of this government, is what we meant.
And to be fair, Marina, Shas is not thrilled that Ram's in the government either. So you're absolutely right to point that out. But
Yes.
yeah,
Aha.
So any thoughts? Do you think any particular party or group won in this budget? Was it split evenly? How would you describe? This is the first major accomplishment of this new government. What do you make of it? What does it tell us about where Israel might be going? Who's winning politically?
I think it was somewhat split because I was really amazed at how many social concerns they were trying to cover in this. I didn't expect such a budget to have that, especially knowing how our American one works. Especially with the women, that was fascinating. Education, housing, transportation, climate control. And then, of course, you had the mix with Bennett's lowering of taxes and more competition, et cetera.
Using regulations.
Right. Great. Well, that's a good overview. Thank you. And I think it is an interesting mix. And if you think about Israeli politics and compare it to a lot of trends in European politics, you do have the mix of the left and the right at play here in this budget. But as you said, a lot of social welfare benefits and the deregulation piece also. Good. Any other questions, thoughts, or comments before we proceed?
We didn't get to implementing kashrut reforms. What does
Yeah, okay, so let's see.
Let's pull that one up. That's an important one. Yeah, let's look at that text one more time all together and talk about it a bit, because it is very interesting one. All right, so let me read it aloud and then we'll talk about it. Implementing kashrut reforms aimed at significantly reforming the kosher certification industry in Israel and introducing competition. The plan would establish a series of private kosher certification agencies that would be required to uphold religious standards established by the chief rabbinate instead of only the rabbinate itself issuing kosher certifications. So this intersects with a few very interesting issues. Number one, you can see this as deregulation of the kashrut industry. It's a monopoly currently. Give other people the opportunity to participate. But certainly it's a religion and state question too, right? Why the Rabbanut, one ultra-Orthodox particular standard should have control. Though, of course, the text says they're gonna stick to the kind of standards, but different people making the judgments. Different people who are benefiting, profiting from the industry. And there's a wonderful article by the minister who's in charge of all of this, fascinating individual who's a member of the Yamina party and who is really trying to argue, look, I think there needs to be change here for the benefit of Judaism. A long, wonderful interview in the Times of Israel. Perhaps we can distribute through the week if you want to read more about him and how he's trying to make a reform like that. So this is a really fascinating one on the intersection of that first slide we saw of both economics and questions of religion and state, where Israel might be going. It's a really interesting one to
An interesting connection to this is, other people may have seen it, is the question of whether Ben and Jerry's is going to be decertified kosher for political reasons.
That's right. Yes. You may have followed that news from the summer. Yes, about their decision to no longer to serve their ice cream in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and all the controversy discussion around that, the back and forth. Yes.
So this would enable them to perhaps go to a different certification theme.
One wonders, perhaps they will, or perhaps they'll hold to their political stance. It's a really great question. And yes, please, Roberta and David.
I just wanted to go back a second to the housing plan.
Yes, Yoni, if you could put that on the screen, please.
I actually thought that one has the most for everyone, but the greatest risk of conflict and compromise, if you will.
Yes.
Because it affects everyone, but it is so freighted politically as well.
Yes.
If some of these 280,000 homes end up in settlements, right?
Thank you. Thank you for raising that. And we'll probably get into this issue in future classes. Let me say a word about it now. Around the same time as this budget was finalized, there were announcements by the current government to somewhere in the ballpark of 2,000 to 3,000 more Israeli homes in Area C of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And fascinatingly, for the first time in over a decade, they authorized 1,000 Palestinian homes to be built in Area C, which is also an interesting way of the tightrope between the different constituencies within the government. And we'll talk more about that probably in our next class and the ones following. Definitely our next class we will talk about it in terms of how security concerns are straining this coalition and how they're dealing with those tensions between whose homes are getting built and what does it mean for a future, whether it's a one-state, two-state solution, whatever the future security concerns are. And you're right, housing is at the heart of that. So thank you for pointing that out. Definitely. Marina, please.
I noticed that removing hurdles for new homes in the Arab community. Because
Yes.
moment they are rich, they want to build, and they are not allowed. And that's a big, big grief. And now removing these hurdles, that's a Ram victory for sure.
Yes, thank you very much for pointing out exactly. That's a Ram victory, because not only in the West Bank, but going back to what I referenced very quickly earlier, in the Negev, in Bedouin communities, there have been unrecognized towns by the state, which makes it much more complicated to build. But as part of this bill, 3 Bedouin communities are recognized in the Negev. They're able to build in those communities, and that was something that Ram fought very hard for, and can say they delivered for the Arab community. Yes, so thank you.
I would add, and to what John was saying earlier about alluding to a debate that we're going to have next class, it's a Ram victory. It's also a Meretz victory and a labor victory as well, who are essential coalition members too. So, yep, it's all 3 of them. So,
Good. All right. Well, thank you for all that. Well, let's continue on with this budget in mind. And now we're going to go a little bit back to the history, and then we'll take the story forward. So how did we get here, which we're calling from Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky, the cottage cheese and startup nation? Some of these phrases you may know, and if you don't, hopefully by the end of our time today, we'll be touching on all of them. Let's start with Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky. So David Ben-Gurion, the founding prime minister of Israel, one of the founding leaders of the time and representing the Labor Party and how it evolved, versus Vladimir Jabotinsky of the revisionist Zionists, who are the predecessors to the current Likud party, of which former Prime Minister Netanyahu is still a part. I would call them, for those who know the show Hamilton, the cabinet battles, or even from American history, the Hamilton and Jefferson of Israeli politics. If you go back to their thoughts and ideas, you can see and trace them from the time pre-state when they were debating these ideas up through Israeli politics to this day. So what do we mean? Here's a quote we have from David Ben-Gurion going back to 1922. The Zionist movement must be able to carry out the conquest of the land by the Jewish worker and find the resources to organize the massive immigration and settlement of workers through their own capabilities. The creation of a new Zionist movement, a Zionist movement of workers, is the first prerequisite for the fulfillment of Zionism. Without such a new Zionist movement that is entirely at our disposal, there is no future and hope for our activities. And the other quote, we need to create a model society based on social, economic, and political equality. So in those statements, you hear the socialist and the social democratic roots of the Labor Party in Israel, which you could trace in parallel to other European political developments over the 20th century. And that's been one model and one strain. To what extent should the Israeli economy and the role of government be to create that social, economic, political equality, to be about Jewish labor, Jewish workers at the heart of that? And we'll talk more about that history going forward. So that's one model from the left that's been a trend, and we'll trace its ups and downs in a moment. On the other side, Vladimir Jabotinsky had a very different vision of the economy. Without privately owned property, there can be no liberty. As he says, humanity is not striving towards socialism. It is striding the opposite direction. And so if there is such a class, then we, the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, are the enemies of the police superstate and the bearers of the ideology of individualism. Without privately owned property, there can be no liberty. And you may know the word liberal, when it's used in Europe, in European politics, means free market, deregulation, a lot of things that we saw earlier. And that's what Jabotinsky was arguing for, that kind of economy. Not centralized, not social democratic socialist, a free market approach. So from the very beginning, you have these two poles and these two tensions. And we're now going to go on to trace how have they played out over the many years up into politics.
Can I ask a question here?
Of course you may.
For his first name, he's coming from the Soviet Union or Russia. And what year was this statement, or approximately what decade?
Good question. So yeah, this would be pre-state. So this would probably be in the 30s, I would guess this quote would have been made. Yeah, so definitely post-Bolshevik revolution for sure.
But he was born, I think, before the revolution.
Yes, he was born before. Absolutely was born before. Yes.
And he was the Russo-Japan War. So he's an old guard, really an old guard. Not at all.
I'm thinking his attitude towards socialism is probably highly colored by his experience in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's true. And in a minute, when we show you how the bourgeoisie evolves in places like Tel Aviv in the pre-state, show you a few images of that. You can see he's reflecting the political worldview of many, and including some German Jews who would have immigrated, especially in the 20s and the 30s in particular, and the kind of world that they wanted to create, which was different. But very good question on that.
It's also standing for a different class. I mean, the bourgeoisie
right.
versus the workers.
Right.
And, yeah, it's important.
And you feel that tension with Israeli society throughout its history and up until till today. And we're going to kind of trace that now in the coming slides. So let's move on, Yoni, if we could. So again, so if you think of those two poles, I think you can summarize the left versus the right. I think with that, in the interest of time, let's continue moving on. Now we have a sense of those two and see how it's evolved over time. So I'm going to turn it back over to Yoni to trace the institutions and how this story has evolved through the years.
Yeah, my job is to tell you the story from the early pre-state days in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, up until today, and I'll do that hopefully in as interesting a way as possible, while I also am short of time. So here we go. All right, so Ben-Gurion, there is a huge debate within the academic community as to whether Ben-Gurion was truly in his soul a socialist, that was something he deeply believed in, or if he felt more that it was just what was necessary for the development of the Jewish state. Of late, economic historians tend to believe that he was less truly a socialist and more just, he thought that socialism was actually the best path forward for this fledgling state. And really for two reasons. One was with a huge number of people flooding into the country that he either hoped would happen or that actually did happen once the state was formed in 1948. That a pure capitalist society just would not be able to support all of those new people coming in, both in terms of the social services they would need and also in terms of ensuring that they would have access to job markets and be able to be put to work towards building the state as quickly as possible. And so he believed that a socialist model, one that we're going to look at here in 1 second, was going to be the best path forward. When he was pushed by others, particularly those from the Western European American camps, to say socialism doesn't work. Look at the Soviet Union, et cetera. He said, look, if you look at American capitalism, for example, he says the only reason American capitalism was alive today, that quote we looked at from 1934, for example, is because FDR's socialist model saved it. And so we need to ensure that, I'm not opposed to capitalism per se, but socialism has to be there as well, because capitalism itself cannot survive. And we've already seen that in the 1930s. All right, so what does it look like in Israel? It looks like a lot of things, but I think in many ways the case study of the Histadrut, I think, is a great way to sort of think about Israeli socialism. So the Histadrut basically was the big union of Israel at the time, and it controlled wages, it provided jobs, it provided services, and most of the major infrastructure of the state of Israel was run by this thing called the Histadrut. So you can see over here, just moving clockwise around the images, you have building projects on the top left-hand corner. They built pretty much anything that the early state and then pre-state and then early state was going to be building, from roads to buildings, etc. Was done by the Histadrut, by Solel Boneh. Health service. We're moving clockwise. So banking, the workers' bank. You can see in the middle image here on the shipping and moving goods around was done by Zim, etc. And of course, El Al later on, the airline, etc., were all run by the Histadrut. And as you can see, for Mordechai Naor, who's an historian of the Histadrut, you can see in the quote here in the bottom right-hand corner, just talks about how his life, you can see his life was basically from waking in the morning till going to sleep at night, one way or the other, was touched deeply by the Histadrut, from the banking he did, to the jobs he had, to the newspapers he read, to his educational system, was all done by the Histadrut. You can see just how many Israelis over time were members of the Histadrut. So that is socialism par excellence. Things start to shift a little bit, although not in any really significant way, but you can see signs of it beginning to happen in the 1930s and 40s when immigrants from first Poland and then Germany start to make their way into Israel and have an influence. Architecture, you could see on the top right-hand corner, the architecture of Tel Aviv is largely influenced by Germans, middle-class Germans, Bauhaus architecture that is going to inform the way Tel Aviv is going to be set up. Very bourgeois, as you can see, top left-hand corner. Social ways of living with espresso bars, etc., movie theaters, etc. So you do start to see the development of some private industry, bourgeois living, etc., in Israel at the time. Again, it's not really the ethos of the state at this point yet, but inklings of it beginning to emerge in the 1930s in particular. Okay. Things really start to change actually. So this slide takes us already to the 1980s, but I want to actually start a little earlier than that in our story because this is the most famous moment of the Israeli economy shifting from socialism to capitalism is what happens in the 1980s. And I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with it. But before we go there, I actually want to take us to the there we go. I want to take us to the 1960s. We don't have a slide for this, but I'll tell you a very quick story about what happens in the 1960s. Two major developments happen in the 60s that historians say start to really shift Israeli attitudes more globally towards a more American style capitalism. The first thing is the introduction of public broadcast TV, which happens in 1967. The very first broadcast, very excitedly, the government shows a parade of the post-1967 Six-Day War, a military parade celebrating their victory in the Six-Day War. That's the first public TV broadcast, and that opens the doors to public broadcast TV, and you start to see American-style TV seeping into Israel. And so what had been a very inwardly facing culture in Israel prior to 1967, we need to really work on our own culture, develop our own set of Zionist ideology, starts to open up to the world a little bit more through TV. So that's force number one coming from America. Force number two, it won't surprise you to learn, is Coca-Cola and other such products. Coke first makes its entry into Israeli life in 1968. So you have these two twin forces of American TV and American food, etc., opening the doors of Israel to the world in 1968. And so Israelis start to get this taste of the American style of living, and many of them like it. This sort of closed economy of the Histadrut wasn't for many Israelis as wonderful as American TV and Coke seemed to be. And then you have American voices like Milton Friedman, the open market economist coming in the 1970s, sending the message. He says overtly, "Set your country free," he says. So those positive images are then mapped onto a lot of the problems that happened after the other second war in 1973 that shifts the Israeli attitudes away from victory and glory into one of what exactly does our government do for us? After the Yom Kippur War, two things happen that really set Israelis against the government. The first is, of course, that the war itself made Israelis wonder why did our government fail us so badly in this war? We won, yes, but at what cost? And so there's a lot within Israeli society questioning of the Israeli government and what it can provide for Israelis, which will seep into the economy as the Israeli economy starts to collapse in the late 1970s, as it was nationally, globally. And so the Israeli economy was not immune from that global collapse as well. And it really culminates in the early 80s, as you can see here, with a massive spiraling of the budget being collapsing, and of course with prices going out of control as well. And you can see that that you have the shekel, the new Israel shekel, the old Israel shekel, which actually had just begun in the 1980s, being called the shekel. It was actually called the pound officially until 1980. Is spiraled out of control, and you have inflation through the roof, over 400% inflation. You have you have shekel bills of 10,000, 5,000, etc. Okay, so as far as Israelis are concerned, enough is enough of the state-controlled economy, and they in the 1985 they create the Economic Stabilization Plan, which largely was pushed in many ways by American economists who said you need to reset your shekel, get rid of all those zeros, no more printing tons of money to solve your problem, and begin a process of deregulation. That really picks up. So we're jumping ahead a little bit. We'll go back in time in a moment, but a major turning point in Israeli deregulation and the Americanizing, the capitalizing of their economy happens in 2003. And so I want to jump ahead a little bit there to the 2003 moment when Bibi Netanyahu was looking for major loans from America, from the Bush government, and John Snow, the Treasury Secretary of America, of the United States at the time, says, we are willing to give you very high level, highly secured loans. This is the top level loan from America. If, Mr. Netanyahu, you're willing to do the following things, as you can see here on the right. So you need to freeze government spending. You need to cap the budget. You need to cut taxes. You need to deregulate all of those industries we looked at in our chart from the slide from a few images ago from the Histadrut. Start deregulating all those things and get your social spending under control. Major moment in 2003, and Netanyahu agrees to it. Israel gets its loans, and Israel is really now set on a path towards American-style capitalism at this moment. A couple other factors play a major role in that development, and we'll go through a couple more, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion, which I look forward to hearing. I'm sure there's lots of them. All right, so here's what deregulation in fact looked like. And so actually this is looking at the previous slide. This is the promises fulfilled by the Netanyahu government. So just out of curiosity, any that you notice here that you recognize?
Can you make it a bit bigger, perhaps, the text?
Yes, I sure can. Give me 1 second. Just have to move this over. Let's see.
You're asking if we recognize any of these companies?
Any names that you recognize? Yeah.
El Ala, of course.
El Al, that's a big one. Yes, exactly.
And Rafael.
Yeah.
Couple of the big banks.
Yep, the big banks, Mizrahi and Hapoalim and Leumi, which are the big banks.
Bank Leumi.
Yep. The Discount Bank is another one. These all had been previously government run. I need to jump out of the share for 1 second and redo that because my screen was not working for me. There we go. All right. Okay. So that's what deregulation looked like. Now, there's enormous controversy as to who now owns these things and who is benefiting from them. We're not going to get into that. The point is that we are now, as we saw earlier, in an era of deregulation and private ownership. All right, a few other major factors. So just to quickly review, we've looked at privatization, deregulation. We're now going to look at a few more. All right, so as the new startup world in general, not just in Israel, but globally with technology, et cetera, has really started to emerge. The Israeli army and the skills learned in the Israeli army have really come to fore here. And all the technological skills that soldiers come away with has been enormously important in developing Israel into what's called now famously the startup nation. So you have all of these soldiers who have computer skills, et cetera, who leave the army and are able to use those skills in building new companies straight out of the army. And also, the other thing is that the Army is great for technology and skill development. It's also great for networking. You know quite a few other people who have like skills, etc., and also your commanding officers, etc., give you enormous access. And so Israelis have been incredibly successful. Here's just a few of them in building technology-based startups. So that is part one. So the Army has played a part in that. Another major factor in developing a technologically based capitalist society were immigrants from the former Soviet Union, as you could see, particularly in the early 90s, flooding in with enormous skills, with an enormously high rate of PhDs coming into the country and using those skills towards developing new technologies as well. So you have the government deregulating, you have the Army providing soldiers and who have high technological skills, and you have Russian immigrants coming in with their skills as well. And as all of that happens, you can see it's just another measurement of the decline of the socialist state is the decline of the party that was the voice of and the backbone of that socialist ideal, Ben-Gurion's Labor Party, the Avodah Party, which, as you can see here, was darn near in 1969 having its own. It didn't even need a coalition, barely needed to get coalition partners in the government. They were darn near 60 seats in 1969 itself, plummeting to bare existence in 2020. There's been a little bit of a resurgence under new leadership today, but there were many people who, for a while, and still might yet be right, predicting the extinction of the party that had once been the voice and the backbone of the socialist state. And that takes us to today. So Israel is in many ways, and this, taking us back to our initial slide as to what not American Jews think of when they think of Israel, but what Israelis think of when they think of Israel, is this economic divide. And for many Israelis, it's an incredibly exciting time to be living, for example, in Tel Aviv, which is the #1 city outside of Silicon Valley in developing innovation, technological innovation. It is the Silicon Valley of the rest of the world outside of Tel Aviv. So it's incredibly exciting to be in Tel Aviv for that number. The greatest number of startup companies in the world, has a thriving NASDAQ scene, and of course the most scientists and engineers that are coming both from the Russian immigration and the Israeli army. But on the left, you have small business owners who are suffering. And so this is, as you can see, both from COVID, but also from the economic situation that's independent of COVID, that in many ways is symbolized by protests that you can see here that were certainly on the eve of COVID, but certainly have not gotten much better today. And the sign that he's holding up says, "Kaniti cottage, I bought my cottage cheese," meaning I can afford my cottage cheese. "Achshav chaser li rak b'karer v'dira." Now, all I need to get is a refrigerator to put my cottage cheese in, and an apartment to put my refrigerator in. So with this capitalist deregulation society that has really opened up of late, some people are thriving. Some people are doing really well in that economy, as many people like Milton Friedman predicted they would. But on the other side, as Ben-Gurion predicted, you have a lot of people that are left out of that equation.
A quick question.
Yes, so I was going to open it up to questions.
The most scientists and engineers, I assume that's percentage, not numbers, right?
That is per capita. Yes, exactly. Yep. Indeed. Other questions or observations? Robert, yes. Robert, sorry. Oh, Robert, can you hear me?
Roberta, you probably got Roberta.
Roberta. Calling Roberta. I was thinking of David. Look at Roberta. David, yes.
Sorry. This may be neither here nor there, and you can tell me to shut up. But one thing that strikes me about a lot of these slides and these points, starting with Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky going to this slide, is it's all about hard work. The Zionist socialist, developers of the nation pre-state worked hard, and they were motivated by Zionism and socialism. The bourgeoisie worked hard. They were motivated perhaps by private interest, but it still motivated them to work hard, to become the startup nation. Everyone had to work hard. And believe it or not, the religious work hard too. They work hard studying and going to, temple. This is not easy. And their women work hard to support the family. So it's like so much of Israel is about working hard. And so part of the question is, who supports the people who, despite their hard work, don't have as good a life, right, as perhaps the bourgeoisie? I don't know. I just throw that out there.
No, it's a really good question. And in fact, actually, so you saw in some of the ads, I think, some of the parties trying to answer that question. Meretz certainly wants to make sure that those people, and they would argue, no fault of their own, are left out of the equation. They need to be supported. And I think Shas and Ram would agree with that as well. I think you're absolutely right to note both of those things. Yep, absolutely. Rick, yeah. Rick.
Yes, all through this discussion, to me, there's one missing element, and that's the Palestinians. It's like the budget and everything else exists by ignoring the Palestinians, and nobody seems to think that some solution with the Palestinians will fix a lot of this stuff.
Yep. Where the Palestinians fit into the economy, and as we saw earlier, it's an incredibly complicated question. There are many people, who would say, well, we provide jobs for you, making SodaStream or ballots for the elections, and others who would say that but we need to do more economically. You saw, for example, in the budget, we want to provide new technology jobs, provide access technologically for Palestinians. And others who say not even close to getting where we need to be. So Rick, you're absolutely right. That is a huge part of the story as well.
And just to say that we will definitely be coming back to that next week. A lot of the role of security and Palestinians, their role in society, and how the workforce changed dramatically because of the Second Intifada, at a time when in earlier times, more Palestinian workers, and once that happened, the import of foreign workers. And we'll talk about some of those dynamics next time for sure.
Mm-hmm. So why don't we move forward just a little bit more and tell our story about the smaller parties.
Great. So in our last few minutes, hopefully this context will be helpful to where we're going to go next time, which is in this unprecedented coalition of so many different parties, how do they each get what they want for their community? That's really the big question we want you to walk away with. And some of them come from, as you know, more of the social welfare, social democratic side. Some come from the startup nation side, and it's important to name Naftali Bennett made his fame as a software engineer and his fortune through the startup nation of Israel. And important to see that and think about to the budget we looked at earlier and how he leads in this area. And so next time we're going to touch a bit more on the economics, and Rick, you really set it up beautifully with your question and your comment, is how does that dovetail with the ideological views of these parties when it comes especially to security, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, etc. So we're going to show you that briefly on these last few slides, some of those moments. And just to name, in the first basic law of Israel, it's about passing a budget. And the deadline was supposed to have been today. So we could have been talking here today that there was no budget, or let's see, it's 7 hours ahead in Israel. It could be 6 p.m. They could be doing the last minute trying to figure out could they pass the budget. That didn't happen. They managed to pass the budget early,